Okay, here we go. I'm going to do a couple more chapters from home. So let me share. We're on to chapter 3. Let me go find it. I opened it right here. Yep. Okay, we're at chapter 3. Now, let's see where we left off. Under the sea was the jar of wild blackberry jam that I'd planned to give Mr. Purdy as a present, but I didn't. I picked up the reins and drove away at a clip. As I slowed down for the stream, he yelled after me, "Don't forget to return the sack. It's muslin." Okay, so remember, she had to go to Mr. Purdy to ask for some extra grain, and they're not going to pay until harvest. And some people are for the British and some people are not. And her father seems to be on the side of the British, and Mr. Purdy's worried about that. Mr. Qualm works for him. He's the one that was shooting the rifle, and he definitely is not for the British. And so remember, King George was on her wall, her dad's wall, and the brother took it down and threw it in the fire. So here we go. Chapter 3. The rain had blown away by the time I got home and unloaded the half full sack of meal that Purdy had groaned over so much. Father was at his bench in the barn, working on the grandfather clock that old Mrs. Ryder had brought in when she went across the river to New York City to visit her son. In England, before we came to America, we had lived on a farm and raised a few sheep and planted potatoes. Planted potatoes one year and flax the next. Father was a hard worker and we always did well until we had 3 bad years, one after the other. Then we fell behind in our rent and got dispossessed and had to move off the farm and into Midhurst village. Father hired out a handyman, fixing this and that, mending silverware and things like clocks. He liked his work, but mother missed the farm. She complained most every night when we sat down to supper about how she hated village life. One day she heard from our preacher, Mr. Brandon Carroll, who had gone to America and come back to do some recruiting, how land was inexpensive in a place called Long Island, and how you could grow anything on the land, and how there was always a good market for what you raised because the city of New York was nearby, just across the river. It was the 17th of March when she heard this news from the preacher. By the end of the month, we were on a ship that was sailing for America. Now we were farming again, and Father was doing odd jobs to make ends meet. Things like fixing old lady Ryder's clock until the farm earned enough to pay back the money we had borrowed. I went in the house and brought out a bowl of fish chowder, sweet pickles I had made earlier in the summer, and fresh bread. I'd baked them. I can't read. I went in the house and brought out a bowl of fish chowder, sweet pickles I'd made early in the summer, and fresh bread I had baked that morning. I told Father how Mr. Purdy's mill had stopped running at midnight 3 nights in a row. I want to point out the power of 3. She brings out 3 things, right? Fish chowder, sweet pickles, fresh bread. And then she's talking about Mr. Purdy's mill had stopped running at midnight 3 nights in a row. There we are with the power of 3 again. Trust me, you will see it a lot. So it had broke down 3 nights in a row, started up again at daylight. How in a joke I had said that it was old lady Ryder how I'd said in a joke that it was old lady Ryder who had caused the trouble. Mr. Purdy said that he was going to wait tonight with a gun and blast anyone he saw moving around. He looked at me sharp when he said it, as if he wanted me to carry a warning. Father laughed. It isn't me, and it isn't Mrs. Ryder. It may be Quorum. From what I've seen, he's off in the head. He likely stops the mill at midnight and starts it up again at dawn just to keep from working the long hours that Purdy asks of his mill hands. Likely, Mr. Purdy also sent another warning. I told my father that he didn't want to let us have credit, but more than that, he was grudging and gave us only half a sack. He said that there were 3 of us now who had to eat, but later maybe there'd be less than 3. Father had a spoonful of chowder to his mouth. He put it back in the bowl and laid his spoon down. He walked over to the door and glanced toward the mill. Then he slammed the door and lit a lantern and hung it up to see by, now that he'd shut the sun out. He didn't say anything, just stood there letting his chowder get cold and staring at the floor. Maybe Mr. Purdy didn't mean it. Maybe Mr. Purdy didn't mean it, I said. Maybe he only means to scare you into thinking about the king the way he does. He means to scare me, all right. He's been at it for months now, ever since the first summer. But he hasn't, Sarah. It's the crowd that hangs around him and listens to his rantings that scares me. Hubert Hines, the surveyor, Burton, the drayman, the post writer, John Selden, who spreads gossip like the pox from here to Boston and back, and also Birdsall. He's the worst of them. Mr. Purdy wanted to know why we haven't enough money to pay for a bag of meal when you do tinkering for people and get paid for it. I wondered too sometimes why we are so poor in money that I have to ask for credit every week. I grew bolder. Perhaps you bury it in the ground somewhere. Perhaps I do. I wasn't surprised. I'd had a suspicions for a long time that he was hiding money. Been burying it since early summer, Father admitted, since Purdy first threatened me and Birdsall began to ride. Shouldn't I know where it is just in case? No. If you knew and they came looking for it, Birdsall and his gang, then you'd be bound to tell them. I never would. You don't know what you do. The other day over at Hempstead, Birdsall broke in on Seth Parsons and his wife and asked them for silverware he knew the Parsonses owned. Parsons said they'd sold it. Birdsall men clouted him over the head and knocked him unconscious. He died 2 days later. Mrs. Parsons, they hung up by her thumbs until she told, no matter what, I'd never tell. You'd be foolish. Valuables aren't worth your life. I'm not going to say where I hid them. Nobody knows but me. And it's not money, it's silverware. Silverware? Yes. Father began to eat his chowder and said no more. When he was through eating, he opened the door. He stood for a long time gazing towards Purdy's mill at the fast-running stream and the wheel turning. Father was dark-skinned and his hair was soot black and long. He wore it in a club tied with a leather string. He looked like an Indian. Many people take him for an Indian. Sometimes I felt that he wished he'd been born an Indian and lived in the wilderness and could travel about from place to place when the seasons changed. He had the courage of an Indian too, the courage to stand up to Purdy and Birdsall. He could have kept his thoughts to himself. He could have said that he hated King George, or just kept quiet like most of the people we knew. Now, a club. So the dad has long hair and he ties it in a club, and it was kind of like they took their hair like this and then they wrapped leather around it and it looked like a club on the back. So just so you know what that is and what her dad looks like, and that he looks like an Indian and wished he'd be an Indian. Okay, and in chapter 3.